more time, so I think we'll get started and people can join as they're able. So thank you for joining this forward-facing Sonar webinar. Today's webinar has been arranged at the request of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies Fisheries and Water Resources Policy Committee, which briefly discussed the topic at its committee meeting back in March at the North American. We also have members of the Angling and Boating R3 committee present, as this topic also falls within their wheelhouse. Because there has been so much interest, as you can see from the stream of people continuing to join, because there's been so much interest in this topic of forward-facing sonar, we opened up this webinar to a wider audience. So I'm just going to give a little bit of background on the association for people who may be less familiar with us. So the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies represents North America's fish and wildlife agencies to advance sound science-based management and conservation of fish and wildlife and their habitats in the public interest. So we represent our state agency members on Capitol Hill and before the administration to advance favorable fish and wildlife conservation policy and funding, and work to ensure that all entities work collaboratively on the most important issues. We also have affiliate and contributing member organizations that support the mission of the association. And I should note that we're not an umbrella organization. So the regional associations are independent entities, but we work quite closely with them as partners. So I'm just going to give a little bit of background and then some housekeeping, and then we can get into the presentation. So I'm sure as many of you know, forward-facing sonar, which is also called live imaging sonar, first became a divisive topic on the tournament scene. But as there's been more uptake of the technology by the general public, concerns have been raised about potential impacts on angler behavior and fisheries resources more broadly. Fisheries managers in a number of states are grappling with the potential implications and whether there's a need for management intervention or not. Number of states are working on collecting data and input on these topics. And the technology raises a number of questions about potential impacts, things like how does the technology affect catch rates? How does it affect angler behavior? Are people catching their limits more often? What will it do to the sport of fishing? What are the implications for fisheries resources? Are traditional fisheries management tools able to cope with the impacts of the technology, or is a different management response warranted? And it's also important to note that acoustic fish finding devices don't currently pay excise tax, so they're not contributing to the Sport Fish Restoration Fund in the way that other fishing gear does. So there are questions around the fairness of that as well. So we thought we'd start the discussion with what the research is saying so far. We're very fortunate to have Ben Neely here. He is a fisheries biologist at the Kansas Department of Wildlife Parks and Tourism, and he will be presenting the results of some of his research into this topic so far. And then after Ben's presentation, we will have some time for Q&A. Please note that this webinar will be recorded, and I will share the recording and, with Ben's okay, a PDF of his presentation with those on the call. And with that, I think I can hand it over to Ben.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Saw a lot of familiar names, a lot of names I didn't know pop up. Looking forward to discuss what we've been working on. And are you guys seeing my screen here? Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna start off by prefacing that what I'm going to talk about is a result of a couple experiments that we did, and it was the winter of 2021, summer of 2022, I believe. We started. It was really the COVID winter of 2020 when we really started hearing about live sonar. I'm probably going to refer to it as live scope just because I'm most familiar with the Garmin unit, but I mean all of them when I talk about it. And our commission was receiving concerns from anglers and wanted to know, what's going on with this. And we were tasked as a fisheries division with trying to understand live sonar, how it affected crappie winter fishing in particular, but also just kind of some foresight on what we might expect moving forward with it. So myself, Jeff Cook, and Dr. Keith Giddo at Kansas State University put our heads together and started collaborating on a couple projects. And I'm just going to talk about those results here. So the question about what is live imaging sonar, you guys all know because you're here. The take home here is it's real-time images. So I saw it akin to video, whereas traditional two-dimensional or side scan or down imaging is more of a picture. And I think that's a good way of describing it. So we're used to this traditional 2D sonar where you can see the fish and, you know, we're all used to reading that. We had this down imaging that was a higher frequency that came out a while back, had a little bit better resolution, and that same frequency for the side scan sonar where you could see more. Point being, this has evolved from paper to LCD to what you see here. The technology is going to continue to improve. Fisheries management is always going to be tasked with trying to stay ahead of it. So again, the Garmin is what I'm most familiar with. Talking about this here, it has the forward mode, the down mode, and the perspective mode. All of them are slightly different, but they all give you a different look at what you're seeing in the water and how fish are responding. So, sounds really fun, right? Most of you probably had the opportunity to see it. Here's a video where you can see the fish on the bottom. You can see there's a minnow right there, and it's dropped down right on this fish's nose. You can see the line above it. And the angler is able to set and watch it, see how the fish is responding, put the bait in the exact right position. So I got this slowed down here, but here in a second, you're going to see this fish move up for a little bit. You're going to see an aggressive hook set, and then eventually you land the fish. So it's a great way to see what's going on underwater, which is something that really hasn't been available, up until now. So it looks really fun, right? You're out there, you can see your jig on the screen, your minnow, whatever it may be. What's the problem with it? And the answer is it's created this division. So we have this biological side and we have this social side. And the biological side is what we hear about most from the anglers. It's, questions that we have that they ask is does angler catch increase with use of live sonar? Does it result in larger fish being caught? And perhaps the most important is, does it increase catch rates to unsustainable levels? That's what we're most worried about from the management perspective. The social impacts are things that we think about as managers, but not a lot of anglers are thinking about. And that's the issue of haves and have-nots. We're quick to blame social media for a lot of things, but this may be an instance where people are showing what they have, showing off, for lack of a better term. They're able to catch all these fish. They're able to publicize when they catch all these fish. And it really just makes the whole technique of using live image that much more visible. And then this zero-sum mentality, where if you harvest a fish, I don't get to harvest that fish. So what are we going to do about it? We're going to work on some science. That's what we're here for, right? So winter crappie in Kansas are an open water thing. We will get ice periodically, typically not enough to really focus any fisheries. It's just kind of opportunistic. But what we do have is open water throughout the winter, in most situations. We've designed these projects I'm going to talk about two projects, and both of them were designed to look at casual weekend anglers. So what we wanted to represent was an individual like me who had a boat, who wanted to increase catch rates, who got a live sonar system, and wanted to see how that impacted our catch. And the idea is that these casual weekend anglers make up 80% of our angling base. We're trying to approximate what was going on with them. So we created 16 teams of 2 anglers. Each team had a captain that was basically what we did was we identified these 32 anglers, and then the 16 most experienced live imaging sonar users were assigned as captains. And then so we had these teams. Each team fished 2 days. So we were at one reservoir, and we separated into the north side and the south side. Both were very similar. The idea was to provide a replica of the same population without having any prior knowledge of the location. So if they got on fish the first day, they couldn't go back and do it the second day. But what we did was had people fish on one side, either with or without live scope, and then on the other side with the opposite treatment. Everybody got to use the traditional 2D down scan, side scan, integrated maps. Anchoring trolling motor was another one. So everybody got to use those. Everybody had the same tackle box, same color jigs, same size jigs, same type of jigs. It was all artificial. So what we tried to do was the only difference was either using the live scope or not. What we ended up seeing was our response variable here was total length of crappies. Our hope was that this would handle both size of crappie and number of crappie. We had one team that was really able to get on them, one team that really struggled, and then the rest of the teams just kind of had a normal distribution there in the middle. So when we break it out by team, and there's 16 teams here, 9 of the teams caught more fish using more crappie using live scope, and 7 of the teams caught more fish without using live scope. So we've looked at what it looked like when you can catch a fish, and it looks real easy. And here's another video, and what you see here is this one bigger fish kind of hanging out. Guy's going to drop this minnow down. He's going to try to put it right on the fish's nose. Coming down, the fish is interested. It's going to stop it, going to bring it up a reel. Fish is going to come up and hit it. Except the fish wasn't interested. So one of the things that we saw and one of the things that we heard from the anglers is, yeah, it's great. We can see the fish down there. We can see how they're reacting, but we still can't figure out how to make them bite. And ultimately our results, we could not identify a live image sonar effect on catch with this design. And ultimately that led us that we didn't have any evidence that increased use would be deleterious to our winter crappie fisheries. But one thing that we didn't do was look at any social considerations. So that's where some of this, the haves and have-nots stuff and perception came into play. And we put together this blue catfish experiment, and this was a similar design, but there were some differences. The idea behind this, it kind of stemmed from the paddlefish work in Oklahoma that was demonstrating how susceptible these bigger fish were to folks that were using this live imaging sonar, and how I don't want to say easy it was for them to catch them, but how much easier it was for the anglers to identify what was big and, able to really pick these individual fish out and focus on them. We thought the blue catfish were a great surrogate. We went to a really high density population. Of course, they're a schooling fish. They're large bodied. They should reflect really well, should be relatively easy to find. This time we set up 16 teams again of 2 anglers with at least the 16 most experienced were team captains, so to speak. This time, a methodological difference was that each team was either assigned to use live scope or not to use live scope. So they didn't switch back and forth. They were randomly chosen, and they fished 4 5-hour periods where we had 4 groups of boaters on the water during each of these periods. So basically it gave them an evening, a morning, an evening, and a morning period to fish. Again, all other electronics were available. Again, all of the terminal tackle was standardized, hooks, weights, cut bait. Another difference here is we had this surveyed all participants, and we wanted to gauge avidity, perception, what these anglers thought live scope was doing to their catch, and also a little bit about the behavior, how the anglers were acting. What we saw was the teams using live scope averaged 14.5 kilograms per angling period compared to 17 for teams not using live scope. There was no difference there. We put all these models together. The null model said that, or was the most parsimonious. The only other model with support was the self-assessed skill model. What we derive from this is that catch is basically random at this point, although there may be some self-assessed angler skill driving that somewhat, at least in our experiment. Looking at behavior, so the first variable here is angling. That was time spent angling versus time spent looking for a location, searching for fish. And this was the only significant difference that we saw. What we saw was that anglers that had live scope fished about 80% of the time, and about 20% of the time they were looking for somewhere to fish, compared to anglers that didn't have live scope, where 93% of the time they were fishing as opposed to looking for fish. We looked at time spent fishing in water deeper than 6.1 meters. Typically, anglers using live sonar were fishing in deeper water. Typically, we saw that people that were using live sonar were drifting rather than anchored. So they were drifting through this deeper water. And then we saw that they tended to fish on the bottom. So basically they were finding deep water and then dragging cut bait around on the bottom as opposed to using a slip cork or being anchored.
Right.
When we talked about the perception, so we asked folks that didn't use it, would you spend less time, the same amount of time, or more time searching if you had live imaging sonar? We asked the users if they would spend less time, the same amount of time, or more time. Unsurprisingly, we saw that the non-users said they thought they'd spend more time searching when using live sonar. The folks using it thought that they'd spend equal time or less time searching if they did not have it. And something that's notable here is when we asked them about catch, and this is diving into the perception thing, the anglers that weren't using it, 6 out of 16 thought that they'd have greater catch if they used live imaging sonar, whereas 12 of the only 15 responded here, but thought that they'd have equal catch without it. So basically the anglers that weren't using it thought it would make a bigger difference, and the anglers that were using it thought that it didn't make as big of a difference. So summarizing this experiment, unable to predict catch as a function of live scope use or angler experience, some support that self-assessed skill was related to catch. It was notable that these anglers that had the technology spent more time searching for where to fish than actually soaking bait. Anglers with live scope would expect similar catch if not using it. Anglers without using live scope thought that if they had it, they would have caught more fish, which falls right in with what we expected. Bringing this back around, the specific subjects here were angler behavior, perception, and success. From a behavior standpoint, typically they fish the same range and technique regardless of live scope access and use. However, there's more time, anglers with live scope spent less time fishing. Again, anglers without access thought they would catch more fish. Anglers without access to live scope thought they would catch more fish if using it, but those that used it didn't think it was that big of an advantage. And we just couldn't find any evidence under these scenarios that catch either increased or decreased with use of it. Conclusions for us. So this was admittedly a small scope project. It was a had to start somewhere kind of thing. There's a lot of places we can go with this, and I know there's a lot of good research ongoing. In fact, there's a synthesis paper that I've been working on with 8 or 10 other individuals that have been involved in some of the early science into this to kind of try to frame some of this information and help provide a path forward. But in this particular experiment, we saw limited biological impact of live scope use in these two situations. Ever increasing prevalence of platforms to show off catch, it may inflate perceived impact. One thing that's really lacking that I think would be a great thing to look at is folks that are tied fiscally to angling, that have adopted this technology, swear by this technology. It's really helping out guides, tournament anglers, lodges, resorts, etc. Some looks into that would be warranted. And I'm going to close by positing the good angler theory here that we've operated under the premise that 10% anglers catch 90% of the fish, and that's probably true in a lot of situations. A question here, and it gets a little philosophical, but do those 10% of anglers also invest in the newest equipment? For example, are the same 10% of anglers still catching 90% of the fish? This time they're doing it with live scope, or did the live scope turn those individuals into the 10%? And a big question here is, how do we separate this angler effect from the technology effect? And that's all that I have. I'm happy to entertain questions.
Ben, yep, we have plenty of time for question and answer. You can either type your questions into the chat and I can read it out, or if you'd prefer to raise your hand, we can call on people as they raise their hands and you can read your question out loud. It does look like there was an earlier question in the chat, which was around angling success for live scope and non-live scope for ice fishermen. Obviously not pertinent Kansas, but are you aware of any research underway?
Yep. So there's a colleague in Minnesota that's been working on this, and he, it's preliminary and I don't have final numbers. They presented their information at a recent meeting, and I can't remember which one it was. But it was a lot along the same lines that we saw. There wasn't any profound effect, but there was a lot of between lake variability, where in some instances it seemed like anglers were able to catch more fish, where in others they weren't. And if I recall, the harvest patterns didn't change, so there wasn't a big difference in harvest there.
Also, another question: how is the agency using LIS to assist with population dynamics?
So that's a moving target. Currently we are not, is the answer. We have discussed using it to evaluate habitat use, looking at different types of habitat structure to try to see how fish are relating. I have heard of individuals using it to target fish for net setting, I suppose, to try to target some of these, get hands on some of these fish where they find pods of fish. Previously, it was a side scan thing, and now it's been more effective using the live image. There's a lot of discussion about an occupancy modeling approach where you can use it at fixed locations. The answer to the question is we're not, but there's a lot of thoughts around it on things that we can do, and I wouldn't be surprised in the least to see some of that come up a lot more prevalently.
Another question, was CPUE tracked during the crappie portion, which were limits being reached quicker with LIS?
In our study, we weren't getting to limits. The way we had it set up was those periods, it was 7 hours each day that anglers had to fish. So catch rates would have just been a division by a constant of the actual total catch. So the numbers that you saw could be interpreted as a catch rate as well. But no is the answer. We didn't see it. It tended to be a lot more schooling based, where folks would catch a fury of fish, and sometimes they had the sonar and sometimes they didn't.
It's like Brad Parsons has his hand raised. Brad, would you like to state your question?
Sure. Thanks, Ben. First of all, your summary of that Minnesota study is generally correct, so I thank you for that. However, after that, we looked at just in a general creel survey. I think your question about guides and tournament anglers is absolutely correct, because on the one lake we found I don't know what the fold increase was, but the guide utilizing that technology and bringing multiple anglers out with them, the effect was substantial, to the order of that guide and his clients outfished everybody else on the entire lake over the entire season. So it's real. So that's I think where we're going. And I'll also pop in when we get into limits in terms of the effects of this or any other technology. I think we are completely disingenuous if we don't talk about barotrauma and the release effects on people who are catching more fish. So thanks for your presentation, Ben.
To expand on that just a little bit, those concerns about barotrauma are being addressed. There's some concern in Texas is one place where these pre-spawn fish are much more vulnerable to anglers than they previously were. These fish that are open water and being pulled out of deep water. And I'm sure it's happening other places as well. But yes, the catch and release mortality is real. A colleague in Oklahoma talking about paddlefish is another instance. Those fish were previously, they were susceptible to harvest during the spring in the river when they were moving upstream. Now there's guides that are really honing in on this technology and isolating these fish at a deeper water during the summer. So the catch and release, the barotrauma, the stress, the high water temperature, there are a lot of concerns about some sorts of cryptic mortality that we aren't necessarily seeing in harvest.
Okay, so we have a question from Michael Allen, quite long. So LIS has the potential to increase catchability and harvest rates, but to Alan or to Michael, at this stage, we need a lot more evaluation to see how much impact it has. That's needed before informed management can occur. His question is whether states are addressing this with new studies. He knows of a couple, but is this a priority for research across agencies?
I can defer on that one. I'm uncertain. I agree with the points here. The impact is a big deal. We're somewhat grateful, at least in Kansas, that crappie were the ones that were implicated because of the growth rates and the high natural mortality. Crappie populations are difficult to overfish here, and probably into some of the southern states. It's probably a more realistic scenario for the northern states. But I'm also curious about what folks have to say about this question.
Yeah, any other state reps on the line who want to chime in? Yeah, Todd?
Yeah, thanks, Ben, for the presentation. It's a very interesting topic. A lot of the things that are getting mentioned here, I'm not blind to them, but they aren't a huge concern here. Like, for example, barotrauma, we have very few deep lakes. We have the point that I was going to bring up is knowing your anglers in terms of the catch and release ethic. And we have such a small percentage of folks that are really harvesting large amounts of fish that it's very difficult for us to overfish. Again, not that I'm going to turn a blind eye to it and forget about it, but I put this in the category when I'm initially thinking about it, like, well, people yelled at me when I started using a compound bow. And we have other sight fishing opportunities, and we're not saying that sight fishing is bad, but certainly the concerns about deep fish and targeting them in seasons when they were previously unavailable, relatively speaking, those are important. But there's so much catch and release going on here, whether it's because people don't fish for food or people are afraid of contaminants, or so it's not, I'm not bringing it up to my director as one of the top concerns that we have here, but completely open to continued work on this and to read about it and think about it. So again, thanks for the work that you've done.
It's like Stephen Cook has written in the chat that the synthesis paper Ben mentioned will be done in a couple weeks, and they're happy to share that with the group if the group is interested. And I am going to go on a limb and say yes, I think the group would certainly be interested in seeing that paper. Thanks, Stephen. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Jerry.
Hey, you hear me okay, Alexandra?
Yep.
Okay, so this is Jerry Brown. I'm the fisheries chief in Mississippi. I don't know if our biologist has got on yet, Keith Mills, but if he is, Keith, speak up. I think he was thinking it was at 1. But anyway, we've got the 4 flood control reservoirs in Mississippi, which is very popular: Grenada, Enos, Sardis, and Arthur Butler. And Keith and Arthur, our biologists up there, repeated a study from about 20 years ago where they were doing roving creels on those reservoirs. So they pick one lake a year and they creel about 10 months, I believe, out of the year. And he completed that, and he hasn't written it up yet, but he can say that the catch rates between those using forward-facing sonar, live imaging, whatever you want to call it now, catch rates were twice as high catch per hour. The harvest rates, harvest per hour was 2 to 3 times as high for those with it than those without it. But he did not notice, which is contrary to what many anglers are saying, he did not notice any big change in the size structure of the crappie harvested. So in Mississippi, like everywhere else, I'm sure we hear a lot of complaints or questions. What are y'all gonna do? Well, we don't regulate technology. And of course, every time something new comes out, you hear from people, but what we are doing, we've proposed even stricter regulations, which to my knowledge, we're about as strict in the country on those lakes. We have a 15 daily creel limit, 12-inch minimum length limit, and a 40 fish boat limit. And we have just proposed to our commission to change the daily limit down to 10 and the boat limit down to 25. And and it's not really specifically toward livestock, but it's more just trying to slow down the harvest. We got some other factors that we consider, water levels and year class strength. So, but anyway, just let you know, Mississippi is doing that too. I think he's going to be working with Dr. Miranda to publish at some point, but that's what we're seeing on those, big crappie fisheries.
Jerry. I guess a follow-up question on Mississippi, and then I'll pass to Mike Leonard. It looks like Gregory Glotzbecker says, in Mississippi, we have experienced an explosion in crappie guides. Is there any info about the frequency of guides catching limits pre and post live scope? So I don't know, Jerry, if you can answer that or not.
Well, we know there is a guiding industry has developed up there on those reservoirs, and our legislature actually implemented a guide license last year during a session where it's $500 for residents, $2,000 for non-residents, plus they got to register their boat as a guiding vessel. But we know I think we've sold a little over 100 guide licenses. And I would dare to say the majority are going to be from up in that area. But as far as the creels, I'm not sure how soon they creel whoever they come in contact with, whether it's a guide or a non-guide. I'll let Keith answer those questions if he jumps on.
Jerry, Mike Leonard.
Yeah, thanks, Allie, and thanks, Ben, for the presentation. Mike Leonard with American Sport Fishing Association, trade association for the sport fishing industry. So this has been a really hot button issue within our industry, as I know all of you all know. So what's been really important for us is this exact type of work of wanting to understand to what extent state agencies are able to quantify and actually study and put some real data and information behind what's to date previously just been a lot of speculation and been all those social issues that you talked about, that this makes it way too easy to catch fish and it's going to destroy fisheries. Well, let's see some data to support that. So yeah, it's been really interesting to see more in this come out. I'm really curious to see the synthesis that's going to be out in a couple of weeks. Would just offer certainly us from ASA. I see Gene Gilliland from BASS is on here too. As we continue to get more questions and have to respond more to fears, concerns, paranoia, really from all sides within the industry and the community on this, the more we as associations are able to point to studies that have been going on to, again, sort of do a reality check around this issue is going to be really helpful. And, I think what we're largely seeing from the studies to date, although, again, really eager to see the broader analysis, is perhaps this isn't as doom and gloom as some people are saying. That's not to say there may not be fisheries, certain regions, certain bodies of water where you do see enough of a impact on the resource that would warrant a management response. Of course, would prefer seeing traditional fisheries management tried before, leaping to technology bans. But it certainly seems like whole scale, statewide or beyond bans are awfully premature to be talking about at this stage. But yet that's what we're seeing and hearing from a lot of corners. So yeah, really eager. And then, sorry, last thing, I know I'm rambling, but I was really interested in the point Pat Conzemius made. This is something else that we've been wondering a lot too, is as much as this is improving, potentially improving angler catch rates, the potential on the scientific side to me seems enormous, and would certainly encourage states to really, really focus on how this type of technology could aid in fishery surveys and all the work you all do, because it certainly seems, compared to electrofishing and hoop nets, a much less invasive and potentially more efficient way to do a lot of work that we've been doing, should we figure out how to do it the right way. So I'll stop rambling there, but thanks, Allie, for putting this together.
Okay, Mike, don't go anywhere, because Todd has put a question in the chat box about efforts to require excise taxes on this type of equipment. And it's something that we have briefly discussed in the Sport Fish Restoration Boating Trust Fund reauthorization discussions. It came up at the Sport Fishing and Boating Partnership Council as part of a broader topic on whether we need to take a more holistic look at the current products that are paying excise taxes and which aren't, and whether there needs to be some modernization there. But Mike, if you have anything you want to add on that topic, yeah, feel free.
Yeah, thanks, Allie. Yeah, no, I think it's certainly worthwhile discussion to pursue. We've spent some time. I've been doing this for about 15 years. I gather there'd been a lot of discussions decades ago, as more and more fish finding technology was coming on board, of where it would fit in the excise tax world. Ultimately, back in the 80s, was determined that there were enough other uses of sonar and similar technologies outside of fishing, and due to I think some good hard lobbying effort by certain folks in the industry, were able to convince Congress that excise tax on fish finding technology was not worthwhile. I mean, that said, it certainly seems worthy of a conversation. But Allie, to your point of a comprehensive examination, I think would make a ton of sense. Fish finding technology probably isn't the only product out there that folks could argue can and should be paying some degree of excise tax. So rather than going at this sort of ad hoc based on what seems to be the product of the day that people want to talk about, some sort of broader, fairly objective analysis across the board, and then from there identify products, and then from there begin the very difficult discussion with industry on how to go about convincing companies to start paying more federal tax. I think that's a long discussion, but certainly one worth having.
Any other comments on excise taxes from anyone? Right, and it looks like David Smith has put another paper in the chat, or sorry, a link in the chat referencing a summary of the Texas Parks and Wildlife evaluation, which might be interesting. Okay, yeah, you want to talk some more? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'll just give a quick summary of that.
Okay.
I've been working with Mike Allen and Texas Parks and Wildlife to do. We conducted creel surveys in Texas on 3 major crappie reservoirs, and we looked at how users and non-users compared as far as harvest rates and catch rates, and we did see significantly different differences between users and non-users. But it's important to note we subsetted our evaluations to anglers who are targeting crappies, so it's going to be different from your casual angler. These are the anglers that are consider themselves crappie anglers, and we then calculated potential increases in exploitation based on those harvest differences, and we plugged them into age structured models to see how it might affect the overfishing potential for crappie fisheries. And we found even at exploitation levels up to nearly 80% that with uh, with a size limit regulation, overfishing crappie populations is very difficult to do with their fast growth and small length of maturity. But a YouTube video in there, it shows a summary of the work we've done with this evaluation, and this was something I presented at the Angler Survey Committee. It's a AFS committee where we're trying to connect those who are connected with angler surveys. And yeah, feel free to take a look at that video, and I can put my email in the chat. And if anyone has any questions about our study, I'm happy to answer them.
Looks like you had a follow-up question from Martin in the chat.
Yes, so we ran all of our simulations with a 10-inch minimum size limit. That's the statewide regulation in Texas, and with that 10-inch minimum size limit, we did not see overfishing occur at exploitation up to 80%, but without a minimum size limit, with moderate growing populations and slow growing populations, we saw the potential for overfishing was pretty high for those populations. Without that size limit.
David. Any other questions?
Allie, this is
Jean?
Jean.
Yep.
Gene Gilliland. I thought I'd just, since Mike Leonard talked a little bit about the industry perspective, I thought I would just sort of update everyone on where BASS is in this process as an organization. Our CEO established a technology committee at the beginning of this year to study live technology, live sonar technology, and its impact on our business and our tournaments, our anglers, our fans, our viewers, for the products that we put out on the internet or live stream. And so that, rather than jumping right into some sort of limitations, we have taken the stance of we're going to study it for this season and come up with some recommendations to the committee will come up with some recommendations to management so that sometime towards the end of the summer, they can make a decision on what our company is going to do in terms of limiting or not the technology for our anglers that are competing in Bassmaster tournaments, whether it's at the professional level or all the way down to the high school programs. So there's lots of moving parts that we have to consider. My role is to consider the biological implications, from a bass fishery standpoint, and what agencies are going to be doing. We've got other people on the committee that are concerned with certainly working with our sponsors, many of whom are technology manufacturers with viewership for our live stream products. So there's a lot of moving parts, and we are probably within, I would say, maybe a month or so, at least certainly a month to 6 weeks of making some sort of recommendations that our management can come up with on what they're going to try to tell our anglers so that they can be prepared for the 2025 season. And there's lots of discussion at this point on whether or not this will just affect the professional level, the Elite Series, or will it carry downstream to our Bassmaster Opens, our college, and even our high school anglers? Because we know that if you look at the adoption of the technology, it does seem to be much stronger with the younger generation anglers. The college and high school kids that have grown up with technology are very much in line with adopting this new technology for their fishing. So at that point, it starts bleeding over into the recruitment issues, and is in some sort of limitation or ban going to ultimately affect participation? So we've got a lot of things to look at. So I just thought I'd kind of throw that out there, and if anybody has any questions about where we as a company are going, just thought I'd let people know. Thanks.
Thanks for that update, Gene. Any other questions, comments? And like I said, this has been recorded, so I will send the recording around and the presentation PDF, hopefully by the end of the week. And I will include the link that David sent around as well. And then when we get a copy of that synthesis paper, happy to share that with the attendees if there's interest. So if there aren't any final questions or comments, just want to say a special thank you to Ben for taking the time to be here and present your research. We really appreciate it. Oh, yep, Tom? Oh, maybe it was a mistake. Okay. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for sharing your research, and I will circulate the materials as they become available. And if anyone has any feedback for me or any requests for future webinars, just feel free to shoot me an email. All right, thank you, everyone.